Hello, this is Miss Evelyn with the Veterinary Technician course, again, VT1005. And this is continuing our second PowerPoint in the veterinary receptionist basic skills. And this is on the terminology for part 2, anatomy and breeding terms. So with this, we already covered our first part, and we left off on this slide of external anatomy and a few species-specific terms. So again, in the VT1005, anytime that you see something in bold, italics, underlined, it is probably a word or a term that you need to get into your vocabulary and understand what it means. So we had understood a presentation in this previous part of this PowerPoint about just basic introduction to some basic anatomy terms. But when we talk about other species, there are some specific terms, terminology that's utilized, such as if you're dealing with birds, avian patients. You might call it the beak or the bill. They have feathers. The wattle might be the floppy skin area underneath their beak area. The comb is on top of their head. And they have internal air sacs instead of a true lungs or a diaphragm as such. So those are some species-specific terms you should be aware of for avian or birds. Bovine are cattle. The area that is really loose underneath their neck area is called the brisket. Of course, the female cow is going to have an udder with 4 teats, and they have a rumen stomach, which was already introduced, and they're called ruminants because of the process of how they go through their digestion process. With our canine and feline, a couple terms to understand. The term pinna, P-I-N-N-A, pinna, refers to the ears, the projections of the ears. So we sometimes say the pinna has an injury. So pinna. And we call the area near the tail, the rump, and they may have dew claws. Not all dogs will have dew claws. They should have 4 claws per toe, plus they could have a dew claw. For our caprine or ovine, and these terms were already presented in the first week's PowerPoint, but caprine meaning goats, ovine sheep. They could have what's called the horn butt, a residual area right on top of their head where a horn may have been, and they were polled, P-O-L-L-E-D. Polled means they had their horns taken off surgically, or else they were born that way. And they may also, the goats may also have wattles underneath their chin area. With equine horses, we call it the forelock, where their mane comes down with the hair between their eyes. That's the forelock. Where their scapula joins near their base of their mane and the neck area, and that hump, we call that the withers. That's important because at the height of the withers is where we measure a horse. And of course, they have a hoof, and inside that hoof is an area, soft tissue area called the frog, F-R-O-G, frog. It's kind of a V-shaped area. It causes a lot of problems, or can, in our equine patients. With porcine or pigs, swine, we call the rear end usually the ham area, and of course they have a muzzle, they have a mouth, we usually call it a snout. So if you wanted to draw pictures of these various animals and outline where these few species-specific terms are, that might be a nice tool to help you understand these. With that, we move into breeding and genetic terms. So again, when you're working with clientele or in a feed store area or something on that order, to help with talking to the ranchers that come in, the animal owners, it is nice to understand some of the various breeding terms that might be utilized. Of course, now this is in a alphabetical order, and these are presented on this page. So animal breeding, scientific application of principles of genetics to improve a species or specific breed. Of course, there is random breeding out on the prairies and in the streets of our cities, but when you're really trying to set up a breeding program, an animal breeding program, you're going to be taking it into the principles of genetics to get the best outcome of the offspring. Of course, the term breed, a group of animals selected to have the same set of specific characteristics. So if you think of a German Shepherd versus a Dachshund, they certainly look differently. And so it's the breed German Shepherd dog and the breed Dachshund, and they have specific characteristics that differentiate them from other members of the canine group. So breed characteristics are certainly those visible qualities. How tall is the animal? What is the length? What is the coloration pattern at times? So those breed characteristics. What is the hair coat texture? And then we have the term crossbreed. This is when different breeds are bred and result in a viable offspring. Characteristics from both breeds are mixed together. And then there is selection, is a process of deciding which animals should be allowed to reproduce and pass genes on. So again, that comes back to our animal breeding, a scientific application. We want to select the best animals when we have that as our option, and they're not just wild. Okay, because they're going to be passing their genes on to their offspring. Another term in this is also called the foundation stock, animal or animals that are identified as the genetic basis of a new breed or of a breed. And we'll mention a few foundation stocks as you're introduced to various species through this course. So other breeding genetic terms. So again, these are continuing with some alphabetical areas here. Inbreeding term would be mating very closely related animals. So we have a couple lines down below the term pedigree. So we look at that pedigree, the record of the ancestry. You think about your own genetic ancestry, if you know your grandparents, your great-grandparents. The same way we may look at an animal's ancestry, their AKC papers, their quarter horse registration papers, and see who is in their ancestry. And so inbreeding would be breeding very closely related animals. The dam and the sire, so sire is a generic term for the male in the species, and dam is a generic term for the female when they're bred together. So we look at those, and they may both have 3 generations back a similar animal in their ancestry. That would be really inbreeding. Line breeding is a form of inbreeding when they share an ancestor. Okay, so we're looking at related animals and other times sharing those. Very similar, but you may hear those terminologies. Inheritance, of course, we have that in our human area, of course, too, passing the genes on from one generation to another. And the last 3 on the right-hand side kind of connect together. The term traits. These are the genetic characteristics that are passed on from the parents. And we have 2 different types. We have qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative traits, these are characterized by their presence or absence, such as coat color. Is it curly? How tall is the animal? Maybe it's dealing about weight. So qualitative, okay? something that you can really look at. And typically qualitative are controlled by a much smaller number of genes. But if you have quantitative traits, this would be like how much milk production, how many baby piglets does the sow usually have, and maybe that is a quantitative trait that you want to pass on, is one that has very large litters, and her quality might be that she really is a very good mother. So traits, those genetic characteristics passed on from the parents, and you have qualitative, basically you can see that they're present or not. Quantitative, a little bit harder to control because a lot of genes sometimes come into these, and it's a little more iffy, and just takes a little more trickiness to be able to really keep those coming through the genetic lines. And then, of course, we have Mother Nature that comes with genetic drift. Changes in that genetic makeup and the population, of the population, not the result of any planned breeding. Things just happen. And that happens with our animal world and, of course, in our human world, too. So when we come into breeding and mate selection, so again, some terms here that we bring this together: breeding and mate selection. You have the term closed herd. So if you think of a herd of cattle, it would only have one bull and all the cows, and you know exactly which one the cows are all being bred by. So it's a herd of animals into which no new animals are introduced. So that would be a closed herd. Okay. The generational interval is that average time between the birth of an animal and when it can produce offspring. If we look at cats, they're born, and by 6 months of age, they could produce offspring, 6 to 8 months of age. That is usually sort of the generational interval. If you look at mice, it's much quicker. It's a matter of a month or so, and they could produce offspring. So again, that generational interval. If you look at cattle, it's going to take at least probably 2 to 3 years before a cow is really going to be able to be bred. Generational interval. I just mentioned the terms dam, D-A-M, and sire. So these are the general terms, female parent and the male parent of an animal. And the other general term for the offspring is progeny. Progeny. Two other kind of breeding terms here, again, thinking about breeding, mate selection. We have diseases, and we'll have a PowerPoint that focuses on disease terminology, introduces you to some common diseases that we might see in their veterinary area. But we have congenital disease versus inheritable disease. So congenital is a disease or an abnormality. So, and disease, by the general terminology, is anything out of the normal. It can be a fracture, it can be a misaligned bone at birth, or it can be something that's really caused by a disease organism. So congenital is a disease or abnormality that's present since birth, but it's not inherited. So a lot of times this is when it's environmental, during the gestation process or birth. It might be that the animal is eating something that is harming the fetus development, and the calf has crooked legs when it is born because of having too much selenium, a mineral, in the diet of the cow from the pasture land. Or again, they could be a birth defect, but it's not inheritable. So inheritable disease is where there's really a genetic base behind it. This could be like in our shepherd or some other canine breeds where we have a malformed pelvic area, hip dysplasia, we call it, and that is a genetically, can be genetically passed, and we really don't want to encourage breeding those animals that have that tendency so that we can not be passing it on. This next slide, the gender and parturition terms to know. If you were in an area where you could print this page out, I would highly recommend that you would do that. Short of that, I would hand write it. I would recreate this. Because over the next weeks, as you're introduced to various species, you're going to also be highlighted again to the terminology of their genders in those species. So this table lists our porcine, caprine, ovine, equine. You can see the English pig, goat, sheep, horse that matches up. We got equine that are very young, not over 4 years of age. We have bovine, feline, canine, or our cow, cat, and dog. And then we have rabbit, goose, duck, chicken, and young chicks. There will be a few more that you can add into this kind of a table as they are introduced, but this material is not necessarily going to be on the quiz next week, but it will be involved, some of this terminology, on midterm and on the final. So you do want to start trying to get some of these terms. You might want to use flashcards or writing this out a few times and start looking at the terminology. I'm going to read each species across. You can see the columns. The male intact term, castrated, that means their testicles have been removed. They cannot breed. Female intact, and then they're young, and a parturition. Parturition is the name for giving birth. So in our pigs, our porcine, it is boar, B-O-A-R, barrow, sow, piglet, and I might even call a younger female pig a gilt, G-I-L-T. And when a pig gives birth, it is called farrowing. For our goats, it's buck, weather. Notice how that is spelled. It is not like the sunshine and rain outside weather. This is W-E-T-H-E-R if they're castrated. A doe, female goat, kid, and I'm not kidding, it is called kidding for the parturition term. For sheep, it is ram, wether, a ewe, E-W-E, so spelling's important, a lamb, and lambing. For horses, it's stallion, gelding, mare. A foal is the generic term, foaling. If you have a young horse, under 4 years of age, and it's a male, it's going to be called a colt. If it is then castrated, it's a gelding. But if it's intact, it's a colt. And if young, up to 4 years of age, female horse is a filly. For our cows, our bovine, it's bull, a steer, cow, calf, or a young female would be a heifer, and it's calving, C-A-L-V-I-G. Sure, things are spelled properly. In our cat world, it is a tomcat, is the male intact. We call it a queen if it's been spayed or is not spayed, a queen that's intact. And they have kitten, and queening is the parturition term. For our canine world, it can be dog or a stud, and also dog for the female, or for a young, dog for when they're castrated. A bitch is the female. They have a puppy, and it's whelping, W-H-E-L-P-I-N-E, whelping. In our rabbit world, it is buck. If it is castrated, the male is considered a lapin, L-A-P-I-N. The female is a doe. The babies are kits, and kindling, like wood, kindling, K-I-N-D-L-I-N-G. In our goose world, it is gander for the male, goose for the female. It's a gosling, and you'll notice that all these birds, they are all hatching for the parturition term. In our duck world, it's a drake and a hen for the female, and duckling. In our chicken area, it is a rooster if it has been castrated, and so a lot of times in a meat market area, meat production, we do castrate those chickens, and it's called a capon, C-A-P-O-N. The female is a hen, and they have a chick. If it is a very young male, we call it a cockerel, C-O-C-K-E-R-E-L, and a pullet if it is a female. So begin studying some of these terms. We will come back to them as we highlight the various species. The last few slides talk about male-related terms in breeding, and then also female-related. So on our male-related terms, so when you say an animal is castrated or they castrate, that's removing the testicles so the animal cannot breed. It's also called neutering or neuter. A crypt orchid, and that's one of those medical terminology. So orchid, O-R-C-H-I-D, refers to the testicles, and crypt is something that is hidden. If you think of a crypt as cemetery where the ashes are put in. So a crypt orchid is a hidden testicle. Okay, hidden testicle, and that can be one or both, and they remain in the body cavity, and they were not descended into the scrotum properly. Those can also become a little higher, a much higher rate of cancer there. Sometimes it can affect the development of the animal, and in our dog world and cat world, we quite often will want to castrate those for sure, and not have them in a breeding situation. We have the sperm, the male gamete that carries the DNA, and ejaculate is the release of the semen, or ejaculate is the amount of the semen. So ejaculate is when they release it, ejaculate, amount. Same spelling. Erection, engorgement of the erectile tissue, sometimes blood, and some animals have a bone that's involved in that erection process. And then the semen is the fluid that males will ejaculate that will contain the sperm and nourish the fluid through the process to fertilize. Female-related terms, and we're just about done with this PowerPoint about our anatomy and breeding. So ovarohysterectomy, surgical removal. So ectomy, E-C-T-O-M-Y, is the suffix meaning surgical removal of something. The overo part means the ovaries, and the hyster part refers to the uterus. So this is the surgical removal of the ovaries, the oviducts, and the uterus, and we also call this spaying or spay. The ovum is that female gamete carrying your DNA. Ova, O-V-A, is the plural form. And that ovum will have a process of ovulation, the release of the oocyte from the ovaries to come down the follicle. We have induced ovulators. This is an animal that requires a stimulation from the penis to actually ovulate. That's why we have so many cats, so many rabbits, and I'm not sure about that many llamas, but these are induced ovulators, and unless there's the actual breeding action, they will not ovulate. There's some interesting stories over that one. Gravid is a term that means being pregnant or very large, so being pregnant or large. We have a gestation period. In mammals, this is the period of the time when the offspring develops in the uterus. This gestation period is actually the period of time, and add this into your notes, from the time of fertilization to parturition. That is the gestation period, from fertilization to parturition. And parturition is the delivery of the young. And they have in incubation, when you talk about eggs, we also incubate chicks under a warmer and so forth, but the incubation is really that length of time for fertilized eggs, whether they be chicks or poultry or fowl, or whether they are reptiles. They can also have an incubation. Female-related terms that are continued, we have the pattern of the hormonal and behavioral characteristics, which is your estrus cycle. Now notice the spelling, because in the next bold words we have proestrus, estrus, metestrus, and diestrus. They're pronounced the same way, but the spelling is extremely important. Estrus, E-S-T-R-O-U-S, is the full cycle. It is all the stages of this hormonal and behavioral characteristics in the reproductive status of a female. But there are various parts of that estrus cycle, and those are called proestrus, before the real time of estrus, which is E-S-T-R-U-S, sexual receptivity. Metestrus is immediately after that, and diestrus is between the cycles. And there are various periods of time utilized in our animals. Interestrus is a period in the cats that occur in ovulation when they're not induced via copulation. We have animals that may have only one estrus cycle a year, monestrus. Polyestrus is a cycle followed by each one. And then seasonally polyestrus animals. And we have some that are more what we call long day or short day breeders, depending on how much sunlight is involved. So seasonally polyestrus, and two of those would be horses and sheep. And anestrus, an is a prefix meaning without, so anestrus, no sexual activity. The last slide here, I believe, with other breeding terms, artificial insemination, you should know the abbreviation AI, collecting semen, placing it into a container, and then to artificially inseminate from the male into the female. Some species utilize an artificial vagina to capture that semen. The zygote is a fertilized egg. The embryo is the developing zygote. Dystocia, again, a medical terminology for difficult birth. You have the fetus, which describes the unborn mammal, and at times, if the fetus is stuck, we need to do a fetotomy. So, O-T-O-M-Y is surgical removal of something. So fetotomy is removal of a fetus, and mastitis, inflammation of the mammary glands. Flamen is an upward curling response, usually to some detected sense. Generally, it is around sexual behaviors, more so done by the male, but females may also do this. We have a variety of pictures here that are illustrating this flamen response, and part of this is that there are actually scent receptors around, usually behind the incisors, and by doing this response, the scent from outside will come in and the animal will pick that up. Flamen, upward curling of the lip. And your vocabulary assignment that will be submitted online as directed by your instructor. You're going to study that gender and parturition table. Just studying it now, get familiar with those terms. There are about 81 bold terms in this PowerPoint. I'm going to end up writing those out Handwriting, again, is really great for your knowledge building. The definitions included in your homework will be sort of optional. And then you're going to write 10 sentences. Try to spread those out between the PowerPoint for your choices. This will, again, be directed online. Thank you for your time on this PowerPoint, and enjoy studying.